Since February the 24th of 2022, the world has fundamentally changed.
Overnight in the capital of Ukraine,
Russian troops are closing in on the capital.
The initial strikes that we think we're hearing
Russia has launched a large-scale military attack against Ukraine, calling this an act of war.
It seems that we're back in Cold War times, where the West, led by the United States, is fighting a proxy war against Russia. And the effects of this war have been brutal. Although the estimates vary, the death toll probably ranges in the hundreds of thousands. A New York Times report said that Russia has 300,000 casualties, of which 120,000 have died. Ukraine suffered 200,000 casualties, including 70,000 dead. This would put the total amount of casualties at around 500,000. The war in Ukraine has also cost both sides a huge amount of money. Russia spends around $100 to $120 billion per year on the conflict. The financing on the Ukrainian side is supported by its allies. In 2022 alone, the United States has approved $113 billion to support Ukraine and its allies in Europe. This includes advanced military equipment such as Abrams tanks, HIMARS rocket systems, and the Patriot air defense system. In total, the military equipment sent to Ukraine by Washington is worth $43.9 billion. Other NATO allies have also contributed, mainly Germany with $17.1 billion worth of military aid. Apart from the costs, the war in Ukraine has also had a huge effect on geopolitics. Russia has left a global nuclear test ban treaty, which is a telling sign that things are moving in the wrong direction. A direct confrontation between the US and Russia is more likely now than it was 5 years ago.
When the history of this era is written, Putin's war in Ukraine will have left Russia weaker and the rest of the world stronger.
And Russia's attacks on Ukraine has also encouraged other countries. Nations like Iran, Belarus, and North Korea are supplying arms to Russia to fight Ukraine. Not because they dislike Ukraine, but because they see NATO as their biggest enemy. And China's position, well, that's a whole other video by itself. Beijing certainly doesn't mind the US taking its attention away from Taiwan. Anyways, the last 2 years of fighting have left a mark. And sadly, it seems like this costly and deadly conflict could go on for a while. On the one side, there's Putin, who wants to conquer at least some of Ukraine's territories. Getting the whole of Ukraine has proven to be difficult because of fierce resistance and outside support. But Putin has said that there will only be peace once the Kremlin has achieved its goals. On the other side, we have Ukraine that wants to get back to pre-2014 borders. Zelensky vowed to retake Crimea, which will be a tough battle that Putin doesn't want to lose. Because of these opposing goals, there is no sign of a peace deal coming anytime soon. Meanwhile, the US President Joe Biden has said that he will back Ukraine for as long as we can. With the war heading into its third year now, the exact timeline of the last 24 months might be getting a little bit vague. So, in this video, we'll go over what happened between the start of the invasion in 2022 to the situation we're in now. As with many conflicts, there isn't a fine line of when it began. After centuries of Russian influence, Ukraine became one of the 4 founders of the Soviet Union. It was a very important asset for the USSR because of its industry and agriculture. But as you all know, the Soviet Union eventually collapsed. This led to the founding of the Ukrainian state in 1991. Still, there was a complicated relationship with its neighbor, Russia. Moscow refused to completely let go of its former empire, which was the start of the idea of a Russian sphere of influence. For example, Russia wanted to be the inheritor of the Soviet Union's nuclear arsenal. Ukraine once possessed 1,700 nukes, which it handed over to Russia in the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. In turn, Ukraine would get security guarantees. But Ukrainian politics were divided over what Moscow's role should be. On the one hand, there were strong cultural and historical ties with Russia, but many European Union countries decided to leave Soviet times behind. This includes the Baltic states, Poland, and Romania, who all joined the NATO alliance and the European Union. In Ukraine too, there was a large group of people who wanted this to happen. Leading up to the 2004 presidential election, the division was clear. The pro-Russian candidate won with a small majority, but the pro-Western side believed the election to be rigged. This caused the Orange Revolution, which effectively ousted the pro-Russian candidate from office. When the pro-Russian candidate won again in 2010, he pulled out of a planned deal with the EU. The so-called association agreement would make trade with Europe easier, but it would hurt Ukraine's economic ties with Russia. When the president refused to sign the agreement, there followed yet another wave of pro-Western protests in 2013, called the Euromaidan. The Ukrainian parliament decided to oust the pro-Russian president after he fled to Russia. This was the beginning of the tensions between Russia and the West. Putin was quick to blame outside actors for causing the Euromaidan protests, aka the CIA. To this day, the Kremlin's narrative is that NATO tried to take over Ukraine to pose a threat to Russia. However, NATO countries took a totally different conclusion from the Euromaidan protests. In their eyes, the Ukrainian people wanted to get rid of the corrupt pro-Russian government. A showdown between Russia and NATO over the Ukraine issue seemed inevitable, and in 2014, the fighting began. Following the ousting of the Ukrainian president, Putin held an all-night meeting with his security advisors. The world would soon see what came out of these talks. Not too long after, little green men crossed the border into Crimea. These disguised Russian soldiers took over government buildings and blocked key access points. Because the resistance wasn't strong, Russia quickly took control over the peninsula. After holding an illegal referendum showing 97% support for Russia, Crimea was officially annexed. However, it's important to note that this wasn't completely faked. A US government survey showed that 83% of Crimeans believed the referendum, and 74% thought life would be better under Russian rule. For a long time, Crimea was part of the Russian Empire and the Russian Soviet Republic. It was only in 1954 that the Soviet Union transferred the area to the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. Nevertheless, the 2014 annexation was still an illegal land grab under international law. Russia violated the Budapest Memorandum because it didn't respect Ukraine's territorial integrity. And it wasn't only Crimea. At the same time, a conflict in the eastern Donbass region began. Just like in Crimea, the population of the Donbass is much more pro-Russian. As you can see in the 2004 election results, the pro-Russian candidate had the biggest support in Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk provinces. Putin used this to his advantage by supporting separatist groups in Donetsk and Luhansk. Together with disguised Russian soldiers, these separatists almost took over Mariupol in 2014. But after this escalation, the Ukraine situation lost its relevance for a while. This was because of the Minsk agreements, which established a buffer zone between Ukraine and the separatists. The war continued, but at a much slower pace than before. 7 years later, though, things were changing. From March to April in 2021, Russia suddenly held a large military buildup near the Ukrainian border. According to Russian military, these were just exercises. But not everyone believed the story. The satellite images of Russian military equipment and infrastructure proved otherwise. After a short pause, the buildup continued in October, as shown by new satellite images. When 100,000 troops were stationed next to Ukraine in December, it was obvious. Russia was going to invade. In January, US President Joe Biden claimed an invasion was imminent. A few weeks later, President Biden was proven right. The war begins. On February 24th of 2022, the news of the invasion spread all over the world. We all remember the clips of Putin announcing his special military operation. He claimed he would denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. Soon, columns of tanks and armored vehicles were rolling over the border. Large bombing campaigns targeted many of Ukraine's major cities. The first phase of the war that followed was perhaps the scariest and the most unpredictable. With US intelligence saying Ukraine would be defeated in 96 hours, there was a lot of doubt about NATO's response. Russia invaded from 3 axes: Crimea, Belarus, and its vast border in the east. Most people thought this would overwhelm the Ukrainian defenses, but the strong Ukrainian resistance that came afterwards proved everyone wrong. The incident at Snake Island, a small islet in the Black Sea, perfectly describes what happened. The Russian Moskva cruiser demanded that the Ukrainian soldiers laid down their arms, to which they replied, "The Ukrainian people didn't want to surrender. Instead, they took up arms." The Ukrainian president was also not planning on giving up. After Zelensky received an offer by the United States for an evacuation, he said that he needed ammunition, not a ride. This was a bold move because the Russians were trying to assassinate him. According to Ukraine, Putin instructed the Chechen leader to send assassins to Kiev. Putin also ordered people from the Wagner Group and the Red Hat private military company to go after Zelensky. But as we all know, these attempts have been unsuccessful so far. Apart from the strong resistance, there was another unpleasant surprise for Putin. His own military wasn't as capable as he thought. In the first weeks of the war, Russia tried to capture Kiev and failed badly. Their plan was to create an air bridge at the Hostomel airport, where Russia could send in weapons and troops. Hostomel is only 6.2 miles, or 10 kilometers, away from Kiev, so this air bridge would allow Russia to decapitate the government. To take control of the airport, Russia prepared hundreds of Special Force commandos to go into Hostomel with helicopters. The problem was that Ukraine already had intelligence about the attack from the CIA, meaning that they were able to prepare. Several of the helicopters were shot down by the Ukrainian air defenses. Over the next days, the airport switched hands a couple of times, but due to heavy Ukrainian fire, the air bridge couldn't succeed. South of Kiev, there was also heavy fighting near the Vasilkiv air base. But here, the Russian forces also failed because of strong resistance. For the next weeks, the Russian and Ukrainian military were fighting in the cities close to Kiev, like Bucha and Irpin. But Russia failed to achieve air superiority, and the offensive stalled. In order to regain momentum, Russia sent a massive column heading towards Kiev. It was a 40-mile or 64 kilometers convoy, with 15,000 troops and hundreds of trucks, pieces of artillery, and tanks. The Ukrainians in Kiev were bracing to defend themselves. But the thing is, the offensive never came. 8 days into the war, the Russian column stalled where it was, just 19 miles or 30 kilometers from Kiev. The reasons are unclear to this day, but there was obviously a big mistake on the Russian side. It could have to do with fuel and food shortages, communication problems, or Ukrainian counterattacks. All in all, Russia failed to swiftly take Kiev, which was clearly something Putin was aiming for. After the offensive on Kiev flopped, the massacre that happened in Bucha soon got worldwide attention. In this town northwest of Kiev, Russian soldiers murdered 458 civilians. Russia claims this was a staged performance, but the Ukrainians don't believe this. If anything, this made the Ukrainian people even more angry at Putin, strengthening the resistance. After 2 months or so, the Russian forces switched their attention from Kiev to southern and eastern Ukraine. In this area, Russia was much more successful at first. Russian forces from Crimea quickly took over most of the Kherson province. Together with the key city of Kherson, this was the first major city and regional capital captured by Russia, falling in just 6 days. Together with the forces from Donetsk, Russia pushed for the Zaporizhia province. Once they united, Russia formed a single front in the southeast. By this point, the key port of Mariupol was in grave danger. It was already under attack since the start of the invasion, but now it was fully encircled. The following siege was one of the worst blows to the Ukrainian side. Ukraine didn't want to give up Mariupol and the Sea of Azov, but the Russian siege came at great cost. There were 3 months of bombardments on the city, destroying 90% of the city's residential buildings. The city had a pre-war population of about 430,000 people, of which most were able to flee. But according to Ukraine, 25,000 people have died in the city. The soldiers in Mariupol retreated to the Azovstal Iron and Steel Works, a huge complex in which they could escape the Russian bombardments. For weeks, these soldiers stayed there without outside support, but eventually, they were forced to surrender. Apart from these gains on the southern front, Russia also had succeeded in the east. It gained a lot of territory in the Kharkiv and Luhansk provinces. However, it failed to take over the capital city of Kharkiv after a period of intense fighting. It's the second largest city in the country and only 19 miles or 30 kilometers from the border with Russia. Obviously, it was a big target for the Russian invasion. At the very start of the invasion, Russian forces captured various towns around Kharkiv. For 2 days, there was actual street fighting in the city between Russian and Ukrainian forces. Afterwards, following a long period of intense bombings on the city, according to American officials, Kharkiv had the worst fighting in the entire conflict thus far. Apart from the fierce fighting in the first phase of the conflict, there was also developments behind the scenes. The most important were perhaps the financial sanctions that many nations placed on Russia. Around $300 billion worth of Russian assets were frozen. Russian banks and central banks were sanctioned, and key Russian imports and exports were blocked. On top of that, hundreds of individuals related to the Russian government were banned. This was retaliation for the invasion, and also an attempt to cripple Russia's economy. The idea was to isolate Russia, to harm its war capabilities in the long run. The most important part of this plan was the EU's sanctions on Russia's oil and gas industry. This trade link was vital to Moscow's state income, as Europe was Russia's top energy export market for years. Through a vast network of pipelines, the EU and the UK imported $147.8 billion worth of Russian oil and gas in 2021 alone. In the same year, 45% of Russia's state revenue came from its energy industry. However, the boycott came at a great cost. There was a global surge in energy prices and a massive wave of inflation in 2022. And initially, the sanctions didn't work as intended. Because of the soaring energy prices, Russia was actually making huge profits. In the first 6 months after the invasion, Russia earned 158 billion euros from fossil fuels. After the sanctions got tougher with price caps, India and China started to buy up Russian oil, be it at a discount. But as you can see on this chart, the Russian energy revenues have been falling gradually ever since. Long term, the energy boycott is having an effect. Another part of the isolation plan was for Western brands to start leaving the country. Companies like Volkswagen, Apple, and MasterCard have all made the decision to leave Russia behind. The total number of firms leaving Russia eventually reached 9,600, but soon it was discovered that these isolation tactics didn't have the desired effect. Many Western brands were simply replaced by local ones, or Chinese companies seeing an opportunity of a lifetime. The companies that left were required to sell their assets at a discount to local startups, and Chinese businessmen founded 1,500 new companies in Russia over the next months. Another big development that deserves to be mentioned is the refugee crisis. By the 20th of March 2022, 25% of Ukraine's population left their home. 6.4 million Ukrainians fled to other countries, and 8 million Ukrainians are internally displaced. An estimated 1.2 million people went to Russia, mainly from the Donbas region. A big part of this group was forcefully expelled, according to the US. Ukraine claimed that 150,000 children from eastern Ukraine were illegally transported to Russia and adopted there. Meanwhile, 4.2 million refugees registered for temporary protection in the European Union. Germany took in the most refugees, followed by Poland and the Czech Republic. Because these countries all stand behind Ukraine, they are willing to provide housing and monthly allowances. After the initial shock of the war was over, though, millions of Ukrainians decided to return. Meanwhile, military support of the West for Ukraine was growing. At a meeting in the German Ramstein Air Base, Ukraine's allies pledged that they would support Ukraine until it achieves a victory. By this point, NATO members had already sent billions of dollars in the form of military aid. This included anti-tank weapons like the Javelin and anti-aircraft missiles like the Stinger, but also armored vehicles like Humvees and small arms. When it was clear that Ukraine stood a chance, the NATO alliance sent increasingly more powerful weapons to the country. For example, the US decided to send HIMARS rocket systems to Ukraine. They can attack targets within a range of 300 miles, or 480 kilometers, and with high accuracy. It has allowed Ukraine to destroy many Russian targets beyond front lines. But military-wise, drones have been just as important. An example of this is the Bayraktar drone, supplied to Ukraine by Turkey. They attacked Russian artillery positions and did reconnaissance flights. Later, the Russian air defenses caught up to the Bayraktar drones, making them less useful. For short-range reconnaissance, Ukraine uses various hand-launched drones like the Puma. It also operates kamikaze drones such as the Switchblade or the Ram-2 to damage enemy armor. Additionally, the Ukrainian forces have bought an army of commercial drones carrying grenades or mortars. Meanwhile, Russia is doing exactly the same. It has reconnaissance drones such as the Orlan 10 and kamikaze drones like the Iranian Shahed 136 and the Russian Lancet. The Shahed 136 was especially gaining a lot of attention because it showed how Russia and Iran were cooperating. Both countries have their issues with the NATO alliance, so they're supporting each other militarily. This is why Iran sent hundreds of drones to Russia, and even Iranian personnel to train the Russian soldiers. Reportedly, Iran even helped Russia build a drone factory in Yelabuga, hundreds of miles east from Moscow. This plant would produce 6,000 suicide drones. In return, Iran would get military hardware from Russia, like Sukhoi 35 fighter jets and attack helicopters. Against all odds, Ukraine successfully defended itself in the initial phase. In March, the Russian forces left the north of the country following the offensive on the capital city. This was after talks in Istanbul, where the first negotiations were held after the invasion. According to the Russian military, retreating from the North Front was a gesture to de-escalate hostilities. Ukraine's story was a little different. It said that Russia left because of heavy Ukrainian resistance in the north. By April of 2022, Ukraine successfully recaptured the entire Kiev, Sumy, Chernihiv, and Zhytomyr provinces. Another important victory was the sinking of the Moskva flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. On April 14th, this ship was attacked by Ukrainian missiles or drones using American intelligence. The Moskva was the very same ship that attacked Snake Island just weeks earlier. So the sinking was both a tactical and a symbolic victory for Ukraine. Going on a little bit of a side tangent, we should also discuss the Black Sea Grain Initiative that formed around this time. Because both Russia and Ukraine are huge wheat exporters, number 1 and 5 globally to be exact, the war had a huge effect on the world's food supply. The Black Sea became a battleground, so it wasn't possible for Ukraine to ship its grain. On top of that, Russia also limited its grain exports. This was a recipe for disaster, as there was a risk of famine in lower-income countries. Food prices soared in 2022, while 20 million tons of grain were held up in Ukrainian ports. Turkey and the UN tried to solve this with the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which both Ukraine and Russia signed. This was a big milestone, because it was the first major agreement since the invasion began. It created a safe corridor through the Black Sea for both Ukrainian and Russian agricultural products. The initiative was successful at first, and it allowed for 33 million tons of food products to leave Ukrainian ports. But even though the food crisis was solved, there wasn't a solution for the conflict itself. Ukraine wanted to continue with its successes by recapturing territory in the south and the east. The problem was that the Russians built a large amount of defensive positions along the front lines. This forced the conflict into its first stalemate. There was a small victory for Ukraine when it recaptured Snake Island on the 4th of July 2022, but the only way to change the course of the war was to break through enemy lines. On August 29th of 2022, Ukraine launched a widely anticipated counteroffensive in the southern Kherson province. But the Ukrainian attack was making slow progress at first. In a bit of a surprise move, Ukraine started a huge counteroffensive in the Kharkiv province on the 6th of September 2022. This part of the front line stagnated after Ukraine successfully defended Kharkiv during March and May. Ukraine took advantage of this and launched a surprise attack. The Ukrainian forces quickly broke through enemy lines, which were already weakened because of HIMARS attacks. Within only 3 days, the Ukrainian troops advanced 31 miles, or 50 kilometers. Russian forces began to flee villages like Izium and Kupiansk, and they suffered thousands of casualties. In total, Ukraine retook 500 settlements and more than 4,500 square miles of territory, or 12,000 square kilometers. At the same time, Russia was making plans to officially annex the Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia provinces. It did this with a referendum, which was likely rigged in Russia's favor. According to the deputy chairman of the Russia Security Council, the territories will be accepted into Russia, and there is no turning back. As a result, a Ukrainian counterattack would be seen as an attack on Russian territory, but the annexation was also a form of propaganda. Putin had to sell the huge mobilization that followed just days after. Because Ukraine made a huge breakthrough, Russia needed reinforcements to send to the front line. To be exact, it planned 300,000 of them, according to Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. Putin said that this was to protect the people in the recently liberated territories. But not everyone liked this. Although the exact figures are unknown, hundreds of thousands of Russians fled the country in the months afterwards. The Prague Process Group estimates that 700,000 to 1.2 million Russians left in the first year of the war. After the mobilization announcement, there were huge traffic jams at Russia's border countries. Most of the people fleeing were of working age, so this was a massive economic blow for Russia. Not too long after the annexation and the mobilization were announced, Ukraine carried out a long-awaited attack in Crimea. In 2018, Russia constructed a 12-mile or 19-kilometer bridge, crossing the Kerch Strait between the Russian mainland and Crimea. It integrated the peninsula with Russia after the 2014 annexation, and it carried military supplies to the forces of Crimea. That is, until the 8th of October 2022. There was an explosion on the bridge, carried out by Ukrainian special services. This wasn't a surprise, because a Ukrainian general said that the bridge was target number 1 months before. The Kremlin wanted revenge, and it soon adopted a similar tactic to damage Ukraine. On the 10th of October, Russia started a massive bombing campaign on Ukraine's infrastructure and power grid. Because it targeted civilian areas, it was widely considered a war crime. In the middle of November, half of Ukraine's power grid was out, and 10 million Ukrainians didn't have electricity. By December, Russia fired more than 1,000 cruise missiles and suicide drones at energy infrastructure. They targeted major cities like Kiev and Kharkiv, but also cities like Lviv, far away from the front lines. This continued for months on end, but Russia's campaign eventually slowed down. This was because Ukraine's allies sent a large number of air defense systems, most notably the Patriot system. This is the best surface-to-air system the US has, with a range of about 90 miles and a cost of $1.1 billion. Throughout the bombing campaign, however, the Ukrainian counteroffensive in the south was grinding on. Because the Russians were taking heavy losses, they decided to abandon the west bank of the Dnipro River. On the 11th of November, Ukraine scored a big victory when they recaptured the regional capital of Kherson. But near the end of 2022, Russia took the initiative again, starting large battles in and around the Bakhmut and Soledar. The escalation led to one of the longest and bloodiest battles in the war. Both sides dug themselves into trenches, and they suffered hundreds of casualties a day. This part of the front was described as the most bloody, cruel, and brutal one, and a meat grinder. After months of costly offensives, Russia captured Soledar in January of 2023 and encircled Bakhmut. Eventually, the Ukrainian troops pulled out of Bakhmut in May after heavy urban warfare. By this point, most of the city was reduced to rubble. Still, it was a key Russian victory. Bakhmut had a strategic value for capturing the rest of the Donetsk region, but the traditional Russian forces didn't receive all the credit for their success, because the Wagner paramilitary group was also involved. Putin hired Prigozhin to send mercenaries to the front, which included many convicts from Russian prisons. According to the Wagner leader, he employed 35,000 regular fighters and 50,000 former prisoners. Although this could be an overstatement. Prigozhin also claimed that many of the advances in Bakhmut were because of his fighters. Despite his successes, the cooperation between the Wagner group and the traditional Russian military wasn't going smoothly. The Wagner leader posted a viral video showing dead bodies of mercenaries and cursing the Russian military leadership for not supplying enough ammunition. In May 2023, just after Bakhmut was captured, the Wagner troops were redeployed. As you know, this wasn't the end of the story for Prigozhin. Eventually, the conflict became entrenched. When we look at changes in territories from the beginning of 2023 all the way until now, we can see one thing: the conflict went into a stalemate. But saying that the war experienced a complete standstill couldn't be further from the truth. While Russia was making small gains in the Donetsk region, Ukraine was preparing for a huge counteroffensive. Countries like France, Poland, Germany, and the United States promised to send tanks and armored vehicles. This was a big shift in NATO policy. At first, Ukraine's allies only focused on sending defensive equipment like anti-tank missiles or air defense systems. But with the tanks and armored vehicles, NATO was giving Ukraine the tools for a counterattack. This includes hundreds of Soviet-era T-72 tanks from mainly Poland and tens of German-made Leopard 1 and 2 tanks. The American M1A2 Abrams tank was also highly anticipated, although it only sent 31 in the end. To support the tank force, the NATO alliance also sent hundreds of armored vehicles. The most important ones were the nearly 1,700 American armored Humvees, but it also included armored personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles. Meanwhile, Ukraine was preparing 50,000 to 60,000 soldiers for the counteroffensive, divided into 12 brigades. However, the attack came later than expected. The plan was to start in the spring of 2023, but this kept getting pushed back. There were multiple reasons for this. For one, the weather conditions were terrible because the ground was too muddy to operate in. On top of that, some of Ukraine's new troops were still in training. 30 allied countries were training 41,000 new Ukrainian troops, but it wasn't completed in time. For example, the US training for the Abrams tanks only began in May of 2023, and a lot of the weapons that were promised to Ukraine hadn't arrived yet. In May, only 100 of the planned 300 tanks had arrived, and only 300 of the 700 fighting vehicles. There was also a big concern that Ukraine wouldn't have enough ammunition for a counteroffensive. Before the attack began, Ukraine already used 2,000 to 3,000 artillery shells a day. It was burning through ammunition faster than its allies could produce. Nevertheless, the Ukrainian military launched the long-awaited counteroffensive on the 4th of June, 2023. Perhaps the biggest focus of the attack was on the southern Zaporizhia province. Ukraine attacked this part of the front from two angles, and it wanted to capture the cities of Melitopol and Berdyansk. The idea was to push towards the Sea of Azov in order to split the Russian forces in two. There were also attacks on the Donetsk front line, where Ukraine tried to push back the Russian forces to Bakhmut and Avdiivka. Additionally, Ukraine wanted to regain towns in the Kherson province on the other side of the Dnieper River. But just days into the offensive, it became clear that it wouldn't be as successful as hoped. The Ukrainian troops encountered strong Russian defenses, which meant that they could only make small and slow gains. In the months before the counterattack, the Russian side built hundreds of miles of fortifications. They were placed in strategic lines of defense to guard the front and key captured cities. These lines included anti-tank ditches, complex trench systems, concrete and steel barricades, and razor wire. But most importantly, Russia placed a huge amount of mines on the battlefield. This made it impossible to swiftly break through enemy lines. By September of 2023, Ukraine had only recaptured 143 square miles, or 370 square kilometers of territory. This included various strategic towns such as Robotyne and Verbov, but it failed to breach through all of Russia's defensive lines. Ukraine couldn't retake the city of Tokmak, which was a minimum goal according to the Ukrainian general. Near the Dnipro River, though, there were some interesting developments. On the 6th of June 2023, the Kakhovka Dam in Kherson was blown up. This raised the water levels in the left part of the Dnipro River, flooding the area of 230 square miles, or 600 square kilometers. It's not known who's responsible, as both sides blamed the other. But it could have been a Russian attempt to slow the Ukrainian offensive in Kherson because it had become harder to cross the Dnipro River. But the world's attention suddenly shifted away from the front lines on June 23, 2023. The Wagner leader Prigozhin turned against Russia's military leaders. He accused them of killing Wagner forces, and he wanted revenge. His mercenaries captured the southern city of Rostov-on-Don and quickly advanced towards Moscow. Russian soldiers took defensive positions in the southwest of Moscow, and military helicopters started to attack the Wagner troops. The next day, Prigozhin suddenly retreated to avoid further bloodshed. The March for Justice ended only 59 miles or 95 kilometers from Moscow. Prigozhin was sent to Belarus without charges, despite being accused for treason. But everyone knew that this couldn't be the end of the story. 2 months later, a plane carrying Prigozhin and other Wagner leaders crashed in Russia. It was probably shot down by Russian air defenses. After the armed rebellion in Russia was over, the focus was once again on the war in Ukraine. The Ukrainian military continued its counteroffensive by attacking behind front lines. It conducted attacks in Crimea, with another attack on the Kerch Bridge on July 17, 2023. This time, it attacked with 2 suicide drones. Ukraine also carried out a small amphibious landing in western Crimea on the 32nd Independence Day. In September of 2023, Ukraine began to attack the Black Sea Fleet. It used Storm Shadow cruise missiles supplied by Britain and France with a range of 340 miles or 550 kilometers. With these missiles, it bombed the Sevastopol naval base and the headquarters of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. As a result, Russian warships were forced to leave Crimea. This was a huge win for Ukraine and its grain exports in particular. Russia had pulled out of the Black Sea Grain Initiative in July, saying that it didn't cover enough Russian exports. But after the Black Sea Fleet left Sevastopol, the new Black Sea Corridor became a safe alternative to shipped grain. This was also because of Ukraine's sea drones, which posed a new threat to the Russian fleet. They're small, remotely controlled boats, which can outmaneuver and strike big warships. Due to these threats, Russian warships steered clear of the Ukrainian coast. Meanwhile, Ukraine also began to strike inside Russian territory, using long-range drones. It attacked buildings in 6 Russian regions, including Moscow. The drones also hit an airbase, destroying 4 transport planes. Ukraine is planning to produce thousands of these long-range drones, so we can expect this to continue in the future. But while drones were changing the situation behind enemy lines and on the sea, the front remained stagnant. By November of 2023, less than 0.2% of Ukraine's territory changed hands over the previous year. Near Kherson, Ukraine captured several small towns on the east bank of the Dnipro River. But after this important Ukrainian advance, nothing much happened on this part of the front. The top Ukrainian general Zaluzhny admitted that the war had went into a stalemate, recognizing that the counteroffensive didn't succeed. He said that there will most likely be no deep and beautiful breakthrough. In the east, Russia was on the offensive again in October of 2023. It moved thousands of troops towards the key cities of Avdiivka and Kupiansk. But Russia also failed to take any meaningful territory after heavy fighting. One of the reasons for the failure of both of the offensives and the counteroffensives is that this war favors defense. With current technology, it's easier for both sides to defend their positions than to gain new territory. This has turned the conflict into a war of attrition, where both sides are using artillery-heavy tactics. Putin seems to be getting ready for a long war, to slowly exhaust Ukraine and its allies. Russia's weapon producers have increased the output of some military hardware by 10-fold. According to the Estonian defense minister, Russia is producing 7 times as much ammunition as Western defense companies. In 2024, the Kremlin plans to increase defense spending by 68% to 10.8 trillion rubles, which would be more than 6% of the GDP. As we know from history, Russia is able to keep a war economy for long periods of time. In World War II, Russia's tactic was to overwhelm its enemy through the sheer amount of resources and manpower. And Moscow is also getting support from its allies. According to Ukrainian intelligence, Russia has received 1 million artillery shells from North Korea. To put that into perspective, the US and its allies have supplied 2 million rounds to Ukraine in the first year and a half. While Ukraine's allies have more money at their disposal, that doesn't mean they have more weapons. Most of the military support given to Ukraine came out of defense stockpiles, but this can't go on forever. The NATO alliance has realized that it must increase military production to continue its support. The situation is especially dire with ammunition, which has been drying up over the past months. According to the EU Parliament report, Ukraine is using up to 7,000 artillery rounds a day, more than 2 million a year. This is more than the NATO alliance is currently able to produce. The European Union could only send 500,000 rounds over the span of 12 months, and the United States Army only produces 30,000 artillery rounds per month, so around 360,000 a year. This is planned to increase to 100,000 a month by the end of 2025, but until then, the ammunition supply will fall short. Meanwhile, the war of attrition is also having an impact on Ukraine's manpower. Its military proposed a plan to mobilize 450 to 500,000 people, which would be a drastic measure for a country of 37 million people. In a war of attrition, Russia definitely has an advantage because of its larger population. To wrap it all up, a lot has happened in the last 2 years of conflict. While this video covered some of the biggest events, it's impossible to do justice to all of the developments. Heading into the third year, we will all be hoping that Ukraine returns to peace. But in the likely scenario that this war drags on, it will be interesting to see how the situation evolves. It's quite possible that next year's video will be even longer.